Hey everyone, welcome into Power Hour. I'm Nicole Auerbach, he's Chris Vannini. We're excited to be here reacting to the latest college football playoff rankings. And Chris, they look very similar to last week's.
Yes, top 8 are the same, top 6, top 4, top 2, but there is a lot to talk about. And there are some points made on that ESPN show that I think we should get into in a little bit. So no change yet. We've got a big November coming. These rankings are going to change dramatically in the next few weeks coming out of this weekend. So don't worry, the excitement is coming.
That is definitely true. So we will just run through them. Again, the top 8 remains the same. So that means it's number 1, Ohio State, number 2, Georgia, number 3, Michigan, Florida State at number 4, Oregon, Washington, Texas, Alabama. Now, the interesting thing here is, of course, Penn State is now into the top 10. So that creates a top 10 showdown this week in Happy Valley. We also saw some other teams sneak in the back part of the rankings as well. But the interesting debate that we saw on the ESPN show was certainly about the order of those one-loss teams. Chris, we talked about this a little bit last week. It was significant that Oregon is the top one-loss team. I think we both believe that they look like they could be national championship caliber team. The question is, does their resume justify them being where they are, or should Texas be there on the strength of that win over Alabama? So what say you?
I tell you what, Greg McElroy made some good points on that show that have me reconsidering Oregon sitting at number 6. As he correctly pointed out, Oregon's best win is Utah a couple weeks ago. Great win. After that, it's Colorado, Washington State. You know, we are putting a lot of Oregon stock into almost beating Washington, into being 2 yards away from a 4th down to winning, from a field goal from sending that game into overtime. And so clearly the committee likes Oregon. We said they were one of the big winners last week, and that's the case again here, and it's exactly that. Now there are a lot of games still to come. Oregon still has to play Oregon State. It's got some other big games coming up November as well. So these are going to change, but I don't know if Oregon should be number 6, even though Greg McElroy, who made that point yesterday, tweeted that he had Oregon at number 6. So I don't know if something changed, but I thought he made some good points.
Yeah, I think that is definitely one of the eye test teams. And especially, I think, because of how we saw them play Washington, we've kind of been grouping those two teams together, anticipating partially a rematch, a potential rematch in a Pac-12 championship game, which we would love to see. But you're right. We do need to adjust some of the results early in Pac-12 play with some of the teams that have really fallen off in recent weeks. Another issue that I think is a very valid one, thanks again to Greg McElroy for bringing this up, is the inconsistency in the policy, or not really the policy, the way the policy is applied between those top teams. Resume versus eye test. So Ohio State is in that number 1 spot on the strength of their wins, which, by the way, shout out to Rutgers being viewed as a quality win. We had CFP chair Boo Corrigan say a top 20 defense in Rutgers. So we need to get our weekly Rutgers shout out into this podcast. But you have that for number 1. And now Georgia is starting to improve their resume now that they finally got a win over Mizzou, who stays in the top 15. Michigan doesn't have any good wins yet. Their stretch run is starting this week. And then Florida State, again, you kind of got to look at some of their wins and their opponents, like their win over Clemson, is boosted actually by this win over Notre Dame last weekend. And so you have to kind of like do the transitive property on some of these. But Washington, by these committees' own rankings, has the best win in the country over Oregon, yet is still on the outside looking in. Also got complimented for the win over USC. So this is what Boo Corrigan had to say about combining the way that he views the eye test and the resume, and the way the committee views combining these two philosophies.
And pieces together, football judgment as opposed to resume, when it becomes similar teams at the margins?
Well, I think the key in the question, Reese, is they're not mutually exclusive. It's not one or the other. You know, as we look through it, and you can tell by our rankings right now with Ohio State and the big wins they've had, including last week over a top 20 defensive team in Rutgers. In Georgia, and the way they've played their games, big win over Missouri. The other wins that they've had this year. Michigan, a little bit of a different schedule as you look at that, but they continue to dominate, including going up 17-0. Last week against Purdue, as well as Florida State getting their wins. Down their two top receivers. It's a mixture of the resume and kind of the football judgment as we look at it. And again, Washington's in there as well with their big win at USC.
So Blue Corrigan is saying that it is a combination, and we know that because that's how you do rankings. You're always you're comparing these two things. Although, Chris, your rankings in particular more resume based than they are necessarily eye test, but the committee does seem to be applying slightly different emphasis on different teams as the season goes on, because he was explicitly asked, is Ohio State the best team in the country? And Chris, I asked you that last week. Where do you stand on that? Is Ohio State the best team in the country, or are they the team that deserves to be number one?
As I said last week, Ohio State, I don't think is the best team in the country, but they are the most deserving team in the country. Yes, even though they barely got by Rutgers, or at least had to pull away from Rutgers, trailed there in the second half. Nick Terry makes a good point in the comments. Ohio State's beaten 7 teams currently with winning records. That counts for something. They've won at Notre Dame. They've won against Penn State, which is a top 10 win. And I think it makes sense. I was very close this week between Georgia and Ohio State. I almost flipped them. I almost put Georgia in after the win against Missouri. The problem is Georgia still doesn't have much else to kind of lean on, especially after Florida went and lost to Arkansas. It's like the next most impressive performance for Georgia was against Kentucky, who's like, okay, but there's still not a lot there. Now, Georgia does have a lot coming up. They've got Ole Miss this week. They've got Tennessee. They've got an okay Georgia Tech team. So Georgia's going to get its chances, plus an SEC championship game, obviously. So between Ohio State and Georgia, I've got Ohio State number one still for now. But Georgia's got a lot more opportunities to change that, perhaps as soon as this weekend. What about you? Between Georgia and Ohio State 1 and 2, which one would you put?
Well, this was honestly the only interesting thing that was possibly going to come out in today's rankings, was whether or not this one win over Mizzou was enough to slide Georgia up, because the committee was already giving Georgia a big benefit of the doubt last week, right? We talked about this coming in. They, at that point, had only 2 wins over teams that had better than 500 records, and that is one of the metrics. Catherine B is she wants to clarify to our everyone on the live show that Mizzou was considered one of the quality wins. Georgia Tech was not considered a competitive game. Catherine, when that game is close, we will come back to you. You will certainly be here in the comment section, and we will pull you on, and you will need to discuss and defend your slander for Georgia Tech right now.
Brent Key is taking that as bulletin board material.
Bulletin board material.
Plus, remember,
sure.
Even what is it? Odd week Georgia Tech or even week Georgia Tech? They win, lose every week. It'll flip. Technically, it's supposed to flip to a win against Georgia. So we'll see. It's probably not going to happen.
One other thought, though, Chris, as you went through the remaining games for Georgia, is Tennessee just moved up 4 spots for a blowout win over UConn, who has won 1 game. Okay, so that is setting up to be a bigger opportunity, a better win potentially for Georgia in a couple weeks when they play that game. Some other.
I'm baffled at. By the way, I've been baffled at Tennessee's ranking all year because they haven't done much. They lost to Florida. They beat Kentucky. They don't have a good win on their schedule. Their best win is UTSA. Their best performance was blowing a big lead against Alabama, and Tennessee's now all the way up to 14. You said I'm very surprised Tennessee has been that high. They have been. I have had them much lower in my rankings than they've been in the polls all year. That's just They just haven't done much yet. But look, that could be a top 15 win for Georgia in a couple weeks.
Yeah, it could be. And you look at some of the teams that slide into these polls, first of all, shout out to Arizona. Awesome season that they are having and what Jed Fish is building. That is great to see them break in. Iowa is now in the top 25 on the strength of 10-7 win over Northwestern. So these are the teams as we look here at 21 through 25, Arizona, Iowa, Tulane, North Carolina, Kansas State. This stuff matters because the committee can sneak in some top 25 wins for teams by putting some teams in this part of the rankings. So there's always some surprises. By the way, I want to talk about Tulane being in there because one of the questions that I wrote for my athletic piece setting up this week's rankings was, what was the group of 5 race going to look like? Because we saw Air Force lose to Army this week. Tulane remains in the poll. We weren't sure. Chris, you and I had both talked about this. Of a ugly game against East Carolina, who has 1 win on the season. Tulane stays. Tulane is in the poll. They inch up slightly. So with JMU ineligible, even though they're trying to petition the NCAA to make them eligible, this feels like it's Tulane's spot to lose in the New Year's Six Bowl for the Group of 5 champion spot.
Yes, it is. And it's going to be tough. Like, they've got UTSA in a couple of weeks, and UTSA has figured things out. Frank Harris is back healthy. That is going to be a very difficult game for Tulane. And if they get through that to the AAC championship, you've got Memphis, you've got SMU, UTSA again, perhaps. Like, Tulane's going to have to earn it if it gets there. It's not going to just waltz its way into the New Year's Six. So there are some big games coming up for Tulane. We don't know if JMU could pop in. They're not eligible for the rankings. Like if that changes, then maybe JMU pops in. We don't know how that's going to go. Something to monitor as well as it pertains to the Group of 5. We don't know how far out Fresno State is, Air Force is, Liberty is. I had Liberty at 25 this week, so we don't know how far Tulane is from everybody else. But because Tulane still has UTSA and a conference championship game against a good opponent, I think it's Tulane's spot to lose.
I will also use a quote from Boo Corrigan on the ESPN show that was in an answer about Michigan, because Michigan could potentially face discipline before the postseason. But this applies to JMU as well. He said that the selection committee is judging teams that are eligible for the postseason. Unrelated to Michigan, he said this is not a CFP selection committee issue. But with JMU, same point. They cannot be ranked because they are not eligible for the postseason. They can get into a bowl if there's not enough 6-6 teams, but that doesn't have to do with the CFP bowls. We're talking about a New Year's Six spot. That is a CFP game, and that is what they are not eligible for. So, Chris, a couple other things I want to circle back on. Washington being outside of the top 4. They beat USC. Now, I don't know if anyone's going to come out here and say, like, Washington has a CFP caliber defense, but you're undefeated. You are beating the good teams in the Pac-12, a conference that we think is really strong, really deep this year. Michael Penix Jr. had some Heisman, at least one Heisman moment in this game as well, but this is a high-powered offense, best win in the country, and they're still not in the top 4. Is that surprising?
Yes. I had Washington out at 5 last week. I moved them up to 4 this week because they went and beat USC on the road. Well, Michigan, which I had at 4, the committee has at 3, just beat a Purdue team that's nothing. So, like, Washington has the best win in the country. They are undefeated, yet they are still outside the top 4, and they still have to play Utah, at Oregon State, and then Washington State in a big rivalry game at the end of the season. That is a tough stretch, and they don't have really any room for error because it feels like, as we said last week, the committee is itching to put Oregon ahead of Washington. They may think Oregon looks like the better team. Now, Washington, yes, they struggled against Arizona State a couple of weeks ago. Stanford kind of, but I thought they got back on track against USC. I was willing to kind of move past that now. So I was surprised. I'm still surprised the committee has Michigan at 3, let alone, I mean, I didn't have them in the top 4. That'll change this week when they play Penn State. But Michigan's ranking continues to be the most baffling one to me for the committee. Again, it'll work itself out, but it's weird.
Well, I mean, what do you think happens if they beat Penn State on the road? I mean, do they go to 1? Is that what the committee is setting them up for? Considering giving them the benefit of the doubt, putting them comfortably in the top 4 when they don't have any top 25 wins?
We will see, because we'll have to compare it to Ohio State, because Ohio State beat Penn State by 8, I think it was, in a game that was not that close. Ohio State was really the favorite. But if Michigan goes into Happy Valley and blows the doors off of Penn State, which I think is possible, I think you could see Michigan jump up to number 1.
Yeah, I mean, again, they're number 3 right now with a very weak schedule, weak strength of schedule. So we will see what they do there. We're already also starting to set ourselves up for a potential scenario where if Alabama wins out, we were talking about them earlier about how you'd rank the one-loss teams. But if Alabama wins out, beats Georgia in an SEC championship game, this is the team we talked about like as inevitable, right? People wrote them off after they lost to Texas, wrote them off after they really struggled with USF in a game that Jalen Milroe didn't start. How would you compare a Alabama team that runs the table to an Oregon team that runs the table? Because it feels like that is a scenario that we could be approaching if both those teams get out there. Those two teams could be the teams that we are looking at for the final spot in the top 4.
This is the nightmare scenario for the committee. If you have Michigan or Ohio State run the table, Florida State run the table, Georgia lose to Alabama in the SEC championship, and Oregon and Texas win out, because then you've got a lot of one-loss conference champions there. Do you put Texas, a one-loss Big 12 champion Texas, against over a one-loss SEC champion Alabama? I think so, because Texas beat Alabama.
They have the head-to-head. Yeah, on the road.
You would think they could. So then does it come down to Alabama and Oregon for one-loss conference champions? It is tough. Now, Oregon's resume to this point is not that much, but they've got USC and Oregon State, and if they avenge their loss to Washington in the Pac-12 championship game, they will have one of the best wins in the country. And I think that is going to be very tough. I just can't see the committee leaving out a one-loss SEC champion at the end of the day. This is the situation the committee does not want to get into.
But Chris, this is a year that the whole narrative in the early part of the season was the SEC was down. The Pac-12 was strong. The Pac-12 was deeper. SEC did not win those non-conference games that we're used to seeing. The middle of the league feels down. You just talked about how you don't think Tennessee should be as ranked as high as they are. If there was going to be a year that the SEC was going to be left out, maybe this is the scenario where you have your champion who has a head-to-head result that they lost at home to one of the other teams that they are being compared to. By the way, Texas is clearly the last hope for the Big 12, by the way.
Yes.
Oklahoma State has 2 losses. They control their own destiny in the Big 12 race, but they are checking in all the way down at number 15. And those are 2 losses that I just don't think they're going to be able to overcome to become the first 2-loss team to make a 14 field. Like, this is a year we've had more unbeaten Power 5 teams later into the season than we're used to seeing. It doesn't feel like it's that year. So it is Texas or bust in the Big 12. All of these other conferences have a couple more. We've already narrowed it down to basically just Florida State. Although I think if Louisville wins out, you'd have to consider them as the CFP contender from the ACC as well. They're at number 11. And again, only 1 loss, and they would have an opportunity to play FSU in an ACC championship game. So I think every conference except for the Big 12 still has at least 2 teams alive.
Here's the question. If you're comparing Oregon and Alabama, where they are right now, Oregon 2 spots ahead of Alabama. Is an Oregon wins over USC, Oregon State, and Oregon worth more or less than Alabama beating Georgia? That's really what it comes down to. Those are good wins you're going to add to Oregon's resume, while Alabama will have the best win if you beat Georgia. That's what it's going to come down to. I would probably personally take Oregon in that situation if you add USC, Oregon State, and Washington to Oregon's resume versus Alabama. But I'm not going to believe it until I see the committee do it. I'm not going to believe that they leave out the SEC champion, presumably leave out the SEC if that happens.
It's a fascinating question, and you have to compare the 1 losses and the context around them. It's going to be really interesting. Alex makes a great point about Louisville's loss. But again, these things don't happen in a vacuum. 1 loss ACC champion, potentially with a win over Florida State, who the committee is giving credit to. They didn't really hold FSU's. Yes, I agree. Oh, wait, who are we talking about? No way, Louisville. Yes, because of the loss, of the quality of the loss. Absolutely. But again, this is an FSU team that we don't know a ton about how the committee feels for them, I would say, Chris. I know that they've been at number 4 both weeks. So far, all we got of them kind of in the danger zone early against Pitt was, well, they were playing without their 2 top receivers, pencil them in, keep them in the same spot. But They are behind Michigan, who hasn't played anybody. Like, we're getting a little bit of mixed messaging, I think, on FSU. So it's hard to tell. Before we wrap this up, reacting to week 2 of the CFP rankings, want to give you guys a glance at what this would look like in a 12-team field. We're going to try to have graphics about this because I think it'll look pretty cool if you guys can see this play out. Ohio State at number 1 would be playing the winner of Alabama and Ole Miss as the first round game. So that would be an 8-9 game. Then we have Georgia at number 2. They would be playing the winner of Texas and Penn State, which a game that would be played in Austin, which would be pretty cool. Number 3 seed. Okay, Florida State. This is where I get confused because they have to be conference champions.
Yep.
Florida State would play the winner of Oregon-Louisville, game that would be played in Eugene. And then Washington would be number 4 in this setup, so they would get a bye, and they play the winner of Michigan-Tulane, which would be in Ann Arbor. So that would be what this would look like in a 12-team field with the 6 conference champions, 6 at-larges, and the rules that were previously agreed to for the 12 team.
Doesn't that sound great? Yet we've got Ari still out here on Twitter saying he doesn't like that whole thing. The idea that the college football, his stance is that the college football playoff starts now because we're going into November with all these top 10 teams basically having a realistic path to get in. And he's not wrong. The problem is, wouldn't it be fun if the top 20 were in the race right now? That's what you're getting with a 12-team playoff. That's why it's going to be a lot of fun because you're going to have even more teams playing meaningful November games. Ari, I'm going to be with him at the TCU Texas game on Saturday. I'm sure we're going to talk this out again, and I'm sure he's going to have his thoughts on this podcast.
You're saying that you think Ari is going to continue to argue about an argument he's made 100 times before? That doesn't sound like him.
We got in an argument about this walking through the mall like a couple of weeks ago. Like it came out of nowhere. It went on for 20 minutes. It's a whole thing. I love Ari. He's great.
We do. We love Ari.
The debate's never going to end.
The debate is not going to end, even though this has already been decided, Ari. It's happening next year. But the interesting thing, again, is we are talking about a lot of teams that are still alive this year because there are multiple teams in all of these Power 5 conferences. We have all the parts of the regions in the country engaged in it. This is what we wanted every single year in the CFP era, in the 4-team era, and it's not always been like this. So this is an aberration. Yeah. It is a great transition year into a 12-team playoff where we're going to have so many more teams alive as we sit here in November.
It's partly an aberration because of so many backloaded schedules. The Pac-12 backloaded its schedule. Michigan had a backloaded schedule with Penn State and Ohio State. We have a lot of inflated records right now that are about to start getting popped because we've got a ridiculous amount of big games coming in November. All of those top 6 teams, top 8, have major matchups still to come. And that's going to be a lot of fun.
They do. So as a reminder, we will be live on YouTube every single Tuesday night. Next week, it's going to be late with the conference Champions Classic basketball. So we're going to have everyone present. I know. Prepare yourselves. It's going to be late. The first game's probably going to go into overtime. We're just going to have to deal with it. But we will be here. And then if you're listening to this in podcast form, we are going to go right into our next segment of the show, and we're going to start by talking about the top shelf, and we're going to be previewing games. If you're watching this live, please go into our feed. You can get the full episode of Power Hour. But again, we'll be live next week on YouTube reacting to the next CFP rankings. So for Chris Vannini, I'm Nicole Auerbach. Thanks for hanging with us, and go listen to Power Hour. Go listen to Until Saturday. The feed is with you all week, and we will see you again next Tuesday.